Have you ever stopped to think why some people walk into a room and instantly command attention while others simply disappear into the background? And why some voices are naturally followed while others are ignored as if they were never even heard? Because the truth is that it's not luck, it's not talent, and it's definitely not intelligence, since you've already seen people who aren't the smartest leading entire teams, people who don't have the best ideas still getting promoted, and people who seem completely ordinary somehow making everyone listen when they speak. Which raises the real question of what is actually happening beneath the surface. Because there is a hidden psychological trait that almost nobody talks about, and once you become aware of it, you cannot unsee it. And today you are going to understand exactly what it is and how it silently separates leaders from everyone else. Let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever hesitated before speaking, not because you didn't know the answer, but because you were unsure of how people would react? And have you ever stayed quiet even when you knew you were right, simply to avoid tension or judgment? Because that exact moment of hesitation is the invisible line that divides leaders from the masses. Since leaders are not people who eliminate fear, but rather individuals who act in spite of it. And the trait behind this behavior is simple, yet incredibly powerful. It is called psychological independence, a quality that most people never fully develop, because from a very young age they are conditioned to do the opposite by following rules, avoiding standing out, staying away from controversy, and making sure they do not make others uncomfortable, which slowly trains them to become dependent on opinions, acceptance, and the need to be liked. Leaders, however, break this pattern, not because they are rebellious for the sake of rebellion, but because they think for themselves and refuse to outsource their identity to the crowd. So imagine two people sitting in the same meeting who both have the same idea and both know that it could improve everything, yet one of them stays silent, while the other chooses to speak, and the one who speaks naturally becomes the leader, not because they are smarter, but because they are willing to step forward, which reveals an uncomfortable truth that most people are not actually afraid of failure, but are deeply afraid of judgment, of looking wrong, of being criticized, and of being rejected, and this fear keeps them stuck, invisible and replaceable, while leaders understand that judgment is inevitable, no matter what they do, so they stop trying to control it, and in doing so they become free. Once a person stops trying to control how others perceive them, they unlock a level of freedom that allows them to speak, act, and lead without hesitation. And if you think about the people you admire, you will notice that they do not seem like individuals who are constantly asking for permission, but rather people who move with certainty, even when they are unsure, because leaders do not wait to feel ready, but instead take action and figure things out along the way, which creates momentum. And this is important because confidence is not something that exists before action, but something that is built through action itself. And this leads to a deeper understanding that psychological independence is not loud or attention-seeking. It is not about dominating conversations or being the most talkative person in the room, but rather about internal stability and the ability to remain unaffected by every external opinion. The moment a person's identity becomes dependent on what others think, they lose control and become reactive, constantly filtering what they say, second-guessing their decisions, and slowly losing the ability to lead their own life as they begin to follow instead, while leaders reject this entirely by developing an internal compass that gives them a sense of direction that does not shift depending on who is watching. And this is exactly why people trust them, because consistency creates authority, and when someone changes their behavior, depending on the environment, they become unpredictable and difficult to trust. But when someone remains steady, grounded, and clear in who they are, others naturally begin to follow them, even without realizing it. Psychological independence is rare because it requires discomfort. It demands the willingness to stand alone at times, to be misunderstood, and to move forward without constant validation, which most people try to avoid because they seek certainty, safety, and approval. Yet leadership does not emerge from safety, but from responsibility, from the decision to step forward even when it feels uncomfortable, risky, or uncertain. And a powerful shift happens when a person stops asking what others will think and instead begins asking what they themselves think, because this single change removes the need to outsource decisions and replaces it with ownership, and ownership is the foundation of leadership. This does not mean ignoring feedback or becoming arrogant, nor does it mean believing that one is always right, but rather learning how to filter opinions by listening without blindly following, considering perspectives without depending on them, and ultimately taking responsibility for one's own choices, which creates clarity. And when a person knows that the final decision is theirs, they begin to think differently, act differently, and show up differently, which is something that people around them notice, even if it is never explicitly stated. An important realization is that the moment someone becomes psychologically independent, they will inevitably lose certain people, because not everyone will like or agree with them, and that is not a problem, since leadership is not about pleasing everyone, but about moving forward with direction. And ironically, the more someone tries to please everyone, the less respect they receive, while the moment they stand firm, even in disagreement, they begin to gain respect, because certainty has a magnetic quality even when it is challenged. People do not follow those who are constantly unsure, who seek validation at every step, and who frequently change their position based on external pressure, because uncertainty does not inspire confidence, whereas clarity does, and clarity comes from within rather than from the crowd. So developing psychological independence begins with small actions, such as speaking when one would normally stay silent, making decisions without overanalyzing every opinion, and trusting one's judgment even when it feels uncomfortable. And while mistakes will inevitably happen, they are not the real problem, because dependence is far more limiting than failure. A person who depends on others to think will never develop their own thinking, and without independent thinking, leadership cannot exist, which leads to another key insight, that people do not follow perfection, but rather conviction, meaning that it is not necessary to have all the answers, but rather to believe in the direction one is taking, because conviction creates momentum, and momentum attracts people, which is how movements begin, not from absolute certainty, but from someone who is willing to step forward despite uncertainty. Now imagine what life would look like if there was no waiting, no overthinking, and no need for approval, and consider how many opportunities would be taken, how many decisions would be made faster, and how much more confidence would naturally emerge, because this is not an unrealistic scenario, but the direct result of psychological independence, which is available to anyone, even though most people never choose it due to the level of responsibility it requires. Once a person stops blaming others, stops waiting for permission, and stops depending on validation, there is no one left to point at, and everything becomes their responsibility, which is where most people retreat, but leaders move forward, because they understand that control comes from responsibility, and the more responsibility they take, the more control they gain over their decisions, actions, direction, and ultimately their life. There are fundamentally two types of people, those who wait and those who move, those who ask for permission and those who create their own path, those who depend on the crowd and those who think for themselves. And the difference between them is not talent, intelligence, or luck, but psychological independence. So the next time hesitation appears, the next time there is an urge to stay quiet, and the next time concern about others' opinions arises, there is a choice to be made. In that moment, the question becomes whether one is leading or following, because each moment of hesitation is also a moment of decision that shapes identity. And the reality is that leaders are not born but built through decisions made repeatedly over time, through moments where action is chosen over fear and responsibility is chosen over comfort, which leads to the final and most important question: